Would you be willing to die for Jesus? I suppose one of the outstanding stories that came from the days of the Boxer Rebellion was about the Christian missionary who was taken by the bandits to their hideout and who was asked if he would give up his faith, his belief in Christ. And he said no. So they took an axe and they chopped off all of his toes and all of his fingers. And then they said, now will you give up your faith in Christ? And he said, never. So they chopped off his hands at the wrists, and then they chopped off his feet at the ankles. And shouted at him again, will you give up your faith? And he assured them that he would not. Then they cut off his legs at the knees and his arms at the elbows. And as this butchering continued, finally, as he was dying in his own blood, they said, do you have any last words to say? He said, yes. Send word to my son to come take my place in China. Well, there are all kinds of experiences of people who have been willing to die for the sake of Jesus. We don't know much about it here in this country. But Jesus was the one who said it. Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. And some of his most outstanding followers have experienced precisely that. Sometimes we forget that. As we consider the life of Jesus and how people treated him and how he treated them, we would be remiss if we did not spend a little time looking at how he was accepted by his closest followers. And accepted to the point of suffering and to the point of paying the ultimate price. The Apostle Paul, of course, was one of them who came a little later, as he said himself, but he's the one who said it in Philippians, the first chapter, verse 29. Unto you it is given in the behalf of Christ not only to believe on him, but also to suffer for his sake. And in every age, Jesus has had followers who are willing to accept him to the point of going through anything for him. The same writer in Philippians, the third chapter, verse 10, gives his big ambition, that I may know him and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his suffering. Fellowship of his suffering. And one of Jesus' closest followers, Peter, wrote it later in his epistle, 1 Peter 4, beginning with verse 12. An interesting comment about those who have paid the ultimate price. 1 Peter 4, verse 12. Beloved, think it not strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened unto you. But rejoice, inasmuch as ye are partakers of Christ's sufferings, that when his glory shall be revealed, ye may be glad also with exceeding joy. Apparently there is an honor guard. Apparently there is an exclusive fraternity, if you please, in the kingdom of heaven of those who have accepted Jesus, whether in his day or in every age, who have been so close to him and have loved him so much that they've been willing to partake in his sufferings and to pay the ultimate price if need be. Now, what does it mean, his sufferings? I suppose that one of the classic examples of one who was a follower of Christ to the ultimate was John the Baptist. He's the one I'd like to focus on for a few moments. Of course, we think of Jesus' disciples and we think of John's disciples, and sometimes we look at the two as leaders of two different bands. But John the Baptist was one of Jesus' closest disciples. And we're told in the comments on John the Baptist's life that God never leads his children otherwise than they would choose to be led if they could see the end from the beginning and discern the glory of the purpose which they are fulfilling as co-workers with him. Not Enoch, who was translated to heaven, not Elijah, who was ascended in a chariot of fire, was greater or more honored than John the Baptist, who perished alone in the dungeon. Of all the blessings that heaven can bestow, there is no greater fellowship and no higher honor than fellowship with Christ in his sufferings. Quite a comment concerning John the Baptist. Well, why did Jesus suffer? If we talk about Jesus' sufferings, why did Jesus suffer? In the first place, we know that Jesus went through all kinds of pain and trouble and torture and suffering for righteousness' sake. It was because he was pure and people who hated him were corrupt that they didn't like him. It was because Jesus came to champion the cause of righteousness that they didn't like him. And sinners have always been uncomfortable in the presence of righteousness. So any person who is a partaker of Christ's righteousness is potential for fellowship with Christ in his sufferings. Another reason why Jesus suffered was because of others, in behalf of others. He came not to save himself, but to save others. And as a result, he paid the ultimate price, took our place, and is a classic example in all the universe and in all time and eternity of someone who suffers in behalf of others. It is possible also, isn't it, for his followers to be fellowship with Christ in this kind of suffering in behalf of others. And another reason why Jesus suffered is because he came down from heaven not to do his own will, but the will of his Father. In other words, he was surrendered to his Father's plan, and the plan that he had negotiated with his Father from the foundation of the world. And he refused to save himself. In other words, he suffered for surrender's sake. He left his life completely in the hands of another. And his followers have discovered the same thing. There are times when Jesus' followers have had the option of saving themselves, such as the Christian missionary in China, or such as the martyrs in all ages. Will you give up your faith? You can do something to save yourself. But doing something to save yourself is the essence of Babylon, and doing it yourself has always been the essence of sin from the beginning. And so we can see aspects in which fellowship with Christ in his sufferings can apply to his followers as well. Let's notice how it worked out in the life of John the Baptist. John the Baptist was one who didn't have much time spent on the streetcars of Jerusalem. John the Baptist had learned to love the quiet and the expanse of the desert. There are people who think that that would be a dismal life indeed, but those who live on the desert have it go into their very blood. I can remember going from college in Southern California out to the desert to go in-gathering every year at field day time. 29 Palm Springs and other places. And there we found ourselves watching the sunset. And we got into our bones the feeling of the space and the color and the beauty. And we began to understand why some people choose to live there. And so it was quite a contrast between the desert and the communion with God that John the Baptist knew. To go from there into the dungeon, the confines of a dark, damp dungeon. And I suppose that we can sympathize with him after Herod Antipas had done his thing to please his wife. We can sympathize with John the Baptist in wondering when Jesus was going to do something. After all, if he's the Messiah, and if he has all the power that he has demonstrated, certainly John would be tempted to join the throngs and the multitudes who didn't expect anything bad to happen to John, that he would be released soon. But instead, the days and the nights went by, and John the Baptist languished alone in the dungeon, apparently forsaken. Can you imagine the contrast, the pain, the questions, yes, and even the doubts? And if we don't see a bigger picture in the great controversy going on, it would be easy to join some of the disciples and doubt concerning John the Baptist. When Jesus came along and said that he was one of the greatest ever born, why would he let him go through this kind of thing? One of his closest followers, his own cousin, if you please. We're told that Jesus did not interpose to deliver John the Baptist. He knew that John would bear the test. The book Desire of Ages says, the test. So there was a test going on. Gladly would Jesus have delivered his faithful servant, but for the sake of thousands who in after generations would pass from prison to death, John was to drink the cup of martyrdom for the sake of others who would suffer. So, John went through this dilemma as some kind of test, and he also bore the pain and the trouble for the sake of others who would be similarly tested. Tested. Well, let's grapple with that for a little bit. Apparently, in the great controversy going on, God needs witnesses that will prove that they are not simply Rice Christians. And one of the reasons he needs those kind of witnesses is because of the enemy's charges that the only reason people serve God is because of what they get from him. The only reason that they love God is because of his blessings. And so we are all very much familiar with the fact that God has chosen to let the rain and the sunshine fall on the just and the unjust. Good and bad alike receive of his blessings, and good and bad alike receive the suffering that comes in a world of sin. Good people are not free from pain. God has never promised peaches and cream all the life through for the Christian or the follower of Jesus. And God has never made arrangements to keep the sun from shining on the bad or the corrupt. And so we see witnesses before the world and before the universe, if you please, who can be trusted to bear the test and to prove that there are those who serve God for God's sake, not for their sake. For God's sake, not for their sake. Now when it comes to the ones who followed, John the Baptist sort of blazed the trail for the other disciples, all except one, of whom died a martyr's death. And the other disciples blazed the trail for hundreds and millions of martyrs who would follow. And the martyrs blazed the trail, and those who suffered, for many people who would go through pain and heartache and disappointment in ages to come, even down to our day, if you please. Oh, we say, we haven't seen any martyrs around lately. Haven't you? Have you seen anyone suffering lately? Have you seen anyone in pain who apparently loves God and has served God faithfully? Have you? You don't have to have the axe of the bandits and the Boxer Rebellion. All you have to have is a cruel foe who started this whole mess in the first place, who loves to see pain and heartache and tears and suffering. And you have people who are martyrs to sickness and disease and affliction and handicapped and all sorts today, modern martyrs, if you please. But all of these people are going to one day stand on a sea that looks like glass, shot through with fire, and they're going to say something very interesting. They're going to sing a song, and they're going to say, "Great and marvelous are thy works, Lord God Almighty. Just and true are thy ways, thou King of saints. Who shall not fear thee, O Lord, and glorify thy name? For thou only art holy, for all nations shall come and worship before thee, for thy judgments are made manifest." Revelation 15, 3 and 4. A group of people who say, "Great and marvelous are thy works, just and true are thy ways. Who shall not serve thee?" Now, I hesitate to paint a picture that would sound too human. Sometimes we bring God down to our level, and we use our language to describe something that can only be known in heaven's language, whatever that is. But I would like to propose a bit of a solution to the question of why Jesus said, "Be thou faithful unto death," for some, and why fellowship with Christ in suffering is the greatest privilege and the highest honor. Apparently, for every person who is lost someday and on the outside of God's city, and who gave up and shook their fist at God and said that God wasn't fair, for every person like that, God needs to have someone on the inside of that city who went through a similar experience, who did not give up and who did not shake their fist at God and charge God with being unfair. The theory in the great plan of salvation and the theory of God and his book and his people is that there are people who respond to Jesus' love and who love him regardless of whether things go good or bad. But God needs exhibits, more than just theory, exhibits to prove that people love him to the ultimate, to answer the enemy's charges and the charges of those who are lost someday, who blame God for their loss. For instance, let's suppose that we come to the end of the millennium, the investigative judgment of the wicked, if you please, 1,000 years. And Christ has come back to earth for the third time. The third coming of Christ has taken place. There is a city that is God's own city that has come down from heaven. And all of the wicked have been raised from the dead. And everyone who's ever lived or died meet for the first and last time. Some on the inside of the city looking out, and some on the outside of the city looking in. And outside of that city, as we come to the great final act in the drama of the great controversy, on the outside of that city, there are people who lived in the days of the flood. And in the days of the flood, the hearts and the thoughts of men's minds was only evil continually. And you see people on the outside of the city shaking their fist at God and saying, "You're unfair. It's not right that I am lost and outside this city because it was too hard to be a Christian, too hard to serve you in the days when I lived." Now, the theory is that it wasn't too hard, that there was grace, that there was power from above, even in the days of the flood. But God needs some real live exhibits. And I can hear a voice from the inside of the city as these people from the days of the flood shake their fist at God, a voice saying, "Noah, please stand up on the wall." And Noah stands up on the wall, and all of a sudden, every mouth is closed. No one has anything more to say. I see some people on the outside of the city one day, when everyone meets for the first and last time, who lived in the days of the apostasy of Israel. And things had gotten so bad that even one of the most godly men felt like he was the only one, but God had thousands who had not bowed the knee to Baal. But there are people on the outside of that city who shake their fist at God and say, "It wasn't popular to serve you in the days when I lived, when the apostasy of Israel was so great, when all we had as leaders were people like Ahab and Jezebel." And a voice from the inside says, "Elijah, please stand up on the wall." And Elijah stands up, and no one has anything more to say. I see some people in the days of the early church when it didn't look good for the church. In fact, Saul already had blood in his eye, and with his sharp mind and his lawyer debate, he was able to wither the early Christians, apparently. And it looked like stoning and the sword, and nothing but trouble. And there were people who gave up in the early church. Perhaps we see some of them standing on the outside of the city at that day, and they shake their fists at God and say, "It isn't fair that I'm lost." And a voice from inside says, "Stephen, will you please stand up on the wall?" And as he stands up, no one has anything more to say. Perhaps some of the closest followers of Christ in the early church were tempted to give up because they didn't see the bigger picture, and perhaps they did under the pressure. But Peter and James and John stand up, who rejoiced after being beaten that they were worthy to suffer for Christ's sake. I see people during the Dark Ages, when thousands and thousands of people gave their lives for the sake of Jesus. And I see others who gave in and chose to save themselves by recanting. And they stand on the outside of the city one day, and they shake their fist at God, and they say, "It isn't fair. It was too hard to be a Christian in the days when I lived." And a voice from inside the city says, "John Huss, And Jerome, would you please stand up on the wall? And they stand up on the wall, those who were burned with green wood in the slow fire, and no one has anything more to say. I see people on the outside of the city who were blind, and got discouraged and charged God with all of the trouble. And they gave up and cursed God and died, and they're outside of the city one day, and they shake their fist at God and they say, it wasn't fair, it was too hard for me to maintain my trust or to even believe in a God who would allow me to be blind. And God has to have someone on the inside of the city who went through that same experience and who's an exhibit, who stands up on the wall and there's nothing more to say. Perhaps Fanny Crosby or others who wrote hymns to God's glory. I see someone on the outside of the city who died a long, slow, lingering death of cancer, and who shook their fist at God and says, if there's a God like this, and they cursed him and they died. And for everyone like that on the outside of the city, God has to have someone on the inside who went through a similar experience, who loved God and trusted him, who stands up on the wall and there's nothing more to say. I see those who are paralyzed, who perhaps languished alone in nursing homes because they had no place else to go. People like we recently buried who all their life suffered with a handicap because of a sickness. And when the brothers and the rest of the family went ahead and did great things in God's cause, all they could do was lie and wait. And perhaps there are those like that who have gotten mad at God and cursed him and died. And for everyone who went through that kind of experience, God needs someone on the inside who trusted him to the end. Isn't that true? So, even though suffering is brought and inflicted by Satan, and as a result of a world of sin, suffering is overruled by God for purposes of mercy. And things can happen in the great controversy in the end, in which the honor guard emerges. The honor guard. You mean to tell me, do you mean to tell me, really, that John the Baptist, who was beheaded in the dungeon after his faithful service to Christ, is greater than Elijah that went to heaven in a chariot of fire? You telling me that Stephen, who was stoned, is greater than Enoch, who was translated without seeing death? You mean to tell me that Elisha, who didn't go to heaven in a chariot, but died after a long lingering illness, is greater than Elijah, his predecessor? Yes, that is what we're saying, and that is what God is saying. Not Enoch, who was translated to heaven, not Elijah, who ascended in a chariot of fire, was greater or more honored than John the Baptist, who perished alone in the dungeon. Unto you it is given in the behalf of Christ, not only to believe on him, but also to suffer for his sake. and of all the gifts that heaven can bestow upon mankind, fellowship with Christ in his sufferings is the most weighty trust and the highest honor. I don't suppose we're going to have people standing up on the wall at the command of a voice inside the city. We do know that there is going to be a replay of the entire great controversy at the end of that 1,000 years. We know that there's going to be a universal television screen of some kind, 360 degrees, if you please, where people on the inside and the outside will be able to look up and watch the drama of the great controversy from its very beginning. We know that everybody's going to see in God's great audiovisual department, Gethsemane, and the drops of blood, and the cross, and the crown of thorns, and the pain, and the separation. Everybody will see it. Everybody will see where they were and how they fit in to the great controversy, whether they were on the inside or the outside. And there will be this honor guard who were faithful unto death. And as the whole scene is enacted, we know that there comes a dramatic moment when everybody, by their own choice, are going to go to their knees and admit that God is fair, that God is love, that God is just, and has been from the very beginning. Even the enemy himself, the arch enemy, who is forced out of his dimension and will be seen by people of all nations and kindreds and tongues. And as they squint at him through narrow eyes, they're going to say, "Is this the man that made the earth to tremble?" And then they'll watch as he kneels down by his own choice and admits that God has been fair and just. Every knee is going to bow, and every tongue is going to confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, and that God is just. It's going to be a dramatic moment, isn't it? It's going to be a big day. And I'll tell you one thing for sure. I'd like to be certain that all of us are on the inside looking out instead of on the outside looking in. And if anyone should be asked to stand up on the wall, I think they will do so reluctantly